Horror has a lot in common with comedy. We can look at things that succeeded and try to tease out reasons why, but pinning down exactly what makes something scary or funny isn't all that easy. And when either one of those things fail, it's very hard to describe what went wrong. There's only so many ways you can say, it just wasn't funny, or I wasn't scared. But there are no hard and fast rules for what makes something horror. It isn't suspense. The French Connection is suspenseful and nobody would ever call it a horror movie. It isn't gore. Army of Darkness is ridiculously gory, but I don't know, that's not really a horror movie to me. The Shining is one of the best movies ever made and produces a level of fear, anxiety, and horror with almost no gore at all. Good horror depends on providing the illusion of real fear in the audience. I have been genuinely afraid at times in my life, but I'm not actually afraid when I watch a horror movie. Instead, great direction, lighting, acting, sound design, writing, all of these things combine to immerse me in a world enough that I can suspend my disbelief and allow myself to experience a simulation of real fear. Horror games need to clear a whole other bar to scare us because the medium is so fundamentally different from film. Because the horror video game genre has been basically defined by the old Resident Evil series, there's been an idea floating around that true horror video games require the player to be powerless. The idea is that the ability to kill enemies ruins the experience by removing any actual fear from the player. This has led to a run of big budget horror games that just aren't really my cup of tea. I didn't finish Outlast or Alien Isolation. I did finish Resident Evil 7 and I enjoyed it, but it's nothing I'd ever replay. I barely remember anything about it and it's been what, a year? So I find this idea that true horror games have to disempower the player to be pretty disappointing. I am an extremely curmudgeonly Italian dude from New York and I simply lack the patience to sit in a fucking locker holding my breath for 30 seconds at a time, waiting until I get to play the game again. And frankly, I also think this rigid formula is too reductive and doesn't account for the kind of genre blending that allows for new and interesting takes on a formula. Aliens is less horror than Alien, but it certainly horrifies without stripping all power and agency from the protagonists. All of this is simply setting something up. It's been 10 years since Visceral Games released Dead Space, the horror action shooter hybrid that remains one of the best games ever made despite never once making me spend 45 seconds in a locker holding my breath. It terrifies without making the player a passive viewer. It allows the player to feel powerful without eliminating the fear and tension that a horror game needs to succeed. It does so much right that I wish this video was about a 4K 60fps anniversary remake, but I guess EA was so scared off by the sales of Dead Space 3 that they're uninterested in the license. Let's take a look back and try to put a finger on some of what made Dead Space so damn good. But let's get the brief history out of the way first, after the logo, y'all. Dead Space was developed by EA's Red House Shores studio, which later became Visceral Games. EA owned the license to System Shock, and Dead Space was originally intended to be a sequel to the excellent System Shock 2. But after witnessing the success of the more action-oriented Resident Evil 4, the team went back to the drawing board to keep the horror sci-fi RPG roots of the Shock games, while also crafting a more action-oriented title. It is very easy to be skeptical of EA these days. We're ending a year where this is EA's entire release schedule. EA is becoming a company that releases nothing but sequels. In fact, in 2018, I think EA did release nothing but sequels. But in the mid-2000s, there was a brief period where EA released a good amount of fresh, interesting games in addition to their normal yearly releases. It is very hard to imagine EA releasing a new IP like Dead Space or Mirror's Edge in 2018. But in 2008, things were briefly different. A tangent about corporate art, if you'll indulge me. I'm an aging hardcore punk rock guy. Here, why don't we take a look at old Pliny so you know who you're dealing with. I'm a person who grew up loving indie label music, and I spent most of my life recording lo-fi indie rock music. I have a great appreciation for the quality of art that can be accomplished outside of the huge corporate media system. All that said, Dead Space is a great example of the positive benefits of being released by a tremendous publisher. When money gets behind a good idea, the sky is the limit. Martin Scorsese's movies are so fantastic because they are art produced by artists with all the resources of the Hollywood studio system at the disposal of the auteur. So when a huge company gives a talented team all the resources they need, as well as the space to pursue their vision, great things can happen. Dead Space got a generous amount of publisher support for new IP. There was a prequel comic book series, an animated movie, and a large marketing push. Production values in the game were sky high with unbelievably good sound design, a fantastic score, good voice acting, good writing, and graphics that were top notch for their time. Dead Space had a lighting system that was absolutely cutting edge for its age. So good that it remains uncannily excellent and stands up to this very day. So at 10 years later, the game still looks pretty damn good, and actually better than Dead Space 2 in my opinion. The game was a surprising success for a new IP, and especially for a new IP survival horror game. It sold over 2 million copies, which was well enough for EA to look to it as an important franchise going forward. Which brings us to the negatives of being with a tremendous publisher. With EA deciding that Dead Space was good enough to be a breakthrough mainstream title, they immediately had the studio begin work on a sequel. Dead Space 2 apparently cost a tremendous amount to make and had less than 2 years development time. Now, it still manages to be a very, very good game, which speaks to the talent in the studio, but the influence of the executive gaze was beginning to be felt. Artists and big business make strange bedfellows at the best of times. Records, movies, and games are made by artists, but they're sold by executives because artists tend to make piss-poor salesmen. Movies and games, more than perhaps any other media, are created by artists and then shaped through negotiation with executives. Creative decisions need to be cleared and approved by people who may not know very much about the genre they're overseeing. And those same executives sometimes insist on including things that make no sense in the design and ultimately hurt the project. In an interesting interview with Eurogamer writer Conor McCard, former Visceral developer and current Crystal Dynamics creative director Ben Watan explains how a great game can slowly lose its identity through this tension between creative desires and executive needs. I'll link to the full interview in the description. It's on SoundCloud and it's really great. I apologize for the sound quality.
So are those suggestions coming from EA themselves, or is that within the design team?
Well, a lot of those kinds of things are kind of outside influences from the game team. They end up being, there's a lot of like franchise review and things that happen in EA where you've got to get through certain hurdles to get kind of the green light to get to the next stage. And is this product going to sell like with what we've got here? Is this a really good value? And are we going to recoup our development losses? I think it's like the marketing folks who kind of look at the other games that are like it and they kind of try and create a composite, right? And so you're always trying to get that number up, and part of the way that the number goes up is by pasting things onto the package that weren't necessarily there to begin with, right? So it's how you sort of end up with a box that you've got to kind of work your way out of.
Sure.
Like, all right, it's got to fill up.
Now, I don't want to make EA out to be the bad guy here. Because if Dead Space had been made by a small indie studio, it almost certainly wouldn't have had the budget to pull off the technologically impressive feats that it did. But that comes with a trade-off. EA isn't happy with a small profit because games are a risk, and risk must be mitigated by significant potential return on investment. Most big companies make these decisions on an actuarial chart with very clear red lines. If a potential deal is likely to return below a certain percentage, the deal doesn't get made. When you're dealing with insurance policies, or bank loans, or municipal bond offerings, accountants and businessmen are pretty damn good at this. That is why the world is lousy with rich people and solid gold toilet fixtures actually fucking exist. But because the special sauce that makes creative output great is literally an intangible form of magic, executives are just throwing darts at a wall or frantically spinning about, looking at what games or movies have sold well and pushing their guys to make a game or movie just like that one. This works about as well as one would expect. The big companies win some, and they lose some, which puts even more pressure on making sure their hits are huge fucking mega hits, because their flops are huge fucking mega flops. Back to Dead Space. After a successful but not successful enough for EA first game, word came down late in the second game's development that it had to include an online component and needed to have more of an action focus in order to broaden the appeal and improve sales. The multiplayer mandate coming down after the game was already in development ended up bleeding resources, bloating the budget, and ultimately added very little value to the product, despite EA executives being convinced that every game needed a crammed-in multiplayer mode. Dead Space 2 sold 4 million copies, which is an impressive total, but it still apparently lost money, and here's where working for a huge publisher can hurt you. About a month before Dead Space 3 released, executive Frank Gabot stated in an interview that Dead Space 3 would need to sell 5 million copies to continue the franchise. With pressure to further alter the game's DNA to appease executives, and looking for ways to reach a sales goal that's very unlikely for a survival horror game, Visceral was forced to make a game that wasn't what they'd intended, and one that didn't appeal to the very customers they were relying on to continue to support the franchise. Now, Dead Space 3 is actually a pretty damn good game, which we'll go over when we get to that video, but it wasn't necessarily a good Dead Space game. With a strange and kinda pointless co-op feature, a straight-up action gameplay direction, and a predatory monetization system, Dead Space 3 reviewed fine, was pretty good, and sold badly. The 4th and 5th games that had already been envisioned were never approved, and the franchise died as a result of a rushed development, overbearing expectations, creative meddling, and probably developer burnout. And all of this could almost certainly have been avoided if EA had realized right from the beginning that the very things that made Dead Space an all-time classic were the very things that would prevent it from ever selling like a Madden or a Battlefield game. So despite Dead Space 3 selling millions of copies, EA considered the title disappointing and shelved the franchise. This is the classic huge media company cycle. It happens over and over. A great example of this cycle comes to us from the music business. Wilco, one of the greatest American bands of the last 50 years, had made 4 critically acclaimed, decently selling records for the label Reprise, which is a Warner Brothers label. At that point, they went to the studio and began working on what ended up being one of the greatest rock albums of all time, Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. The album took their signature 70s rock fused with country sound and layered avant-garde feedback and electronic elements very lightly on top. The album was and remains a masterpiece. But Warner Brothers had just finished a major corporate restructuring to take care of excessive debt. They weren't interested in taking any chances. They were in the business of selling records, not of making art, and it turned out that lately they hadn't even been very good at selling records. Well, the record Wilco gave them didn't sound like the other records they sold. It sounded nothing like the other records that were huge mega hits at the time. It didn't sound like Nickelback or Ashanti or Nelly. It doesn't matter that the album would have turned a profit without going quintuple platinum because they were paying Wilco like they were master electricians rather than rock stars. Warner Brothers wanted to mitigate risk and maximize the chance of a huge surprise hit. They returned the album and told the band to re-record and mix the songs, taking out the feedback and atmospheric elements and mixing it as a straight pop rock album. Wilco refused, and then Reprise turned around and refused to release the album at all. Now, that has a happy ending because None Such Records signed the band and negotiated with Warner Brothers to buy the rights back for the album. It released to glowing praise and excellent sales, cementing Wilco as one of America's great acts. You've almost certainly heard cuts from the album while strolling through Home Depot or a supermarket. Unfortunately, Visceral Games doesn't have as happy an ending. But this video isn't about all of that. This video is a love letter to one of the best games of the last 20 years and one of the very few games that combines player power and action with horror and suspense and manages to be a fun romp and terrifying ordeal all in one package. So let's break down a few of the things that made Dead Space such a success. We're going to look at gameplay, sound design, art direction, performance and graphics, and its surprisingly good story to show what makes this game as good to play today as it was 10 years ago. I've played all 3 of the games twice in the last few months, and maybe after this I'll convince you to go give them another go. If you don't have any ethical concerns with giving EA some money, all 3, as well as the Mass Effect games and the Titanfall and Battlefield games, are part of Origin Access on PC. I'm comfortable with moral ambiguity, so I held my nose and paid the man. Holy shit, I just did a commercial for EA. A brief note. If you're one of the 31 people who've watched any of my other videos, you might have noticed that I generally format these essays in a certain way. I take a game, I play it a couple of times, I think about it for a few weeks, and then I start writing. I like to separate the videos into sections using title cards. I do sections like gameplay, narrative, level design. I even make a little voice, I go, gameplay. But after writing this, I realized that my usual formatting doesn't work very well for Dead Space. And that's because one of the things that makes this so fucking good is that everything in the design is tied back to and reinforced by everything else in the design. Nothing contradicts itself, and each system builds upon and meshes together with every other system. I can't talk about the graphics and lighting without talking about the level design. And I can't talk about the level design without talking about the waypoint system. And I can't talk about that without mentioning the UI. etc., etc. So although I'll try to keep my usual sections, I'm letting you all know that sections will overlap and bleed into each other, and I might get all loopy and start repeating myself. Moving about the Ishimura. In the last couple of years, we've seen survival horror go back to its roots. Games like Outlast, Resident Evil 7, and Alien Isolation use the original survival horror formula of a weak player character and limited resources for a gameplay experience that more closely resembles hide-and-seek with puzzles than an action title. And that's totally cool because there are millions of people who love games like that. Still, because almost all games that bill themselves as horror these days function like this, it's helpful to remember that there was a period where horror and action games were seamlessly blended. Games like Fear, Resident Evil 4, Dead Space, Metro, and BioShock all use their setting and tone to unsettle the player with horror elements, while still giving them the gameplay tools that make a shooter fun. And one of the most important things that makes all of those games work is pacing. A great action shooter should never bore the player with tedium, and a great horror game needs to take its time setting the atmosphere, which makes the unique action shooter horror subgenre more highly dependent on pacing than most other types of games. Dead Space is one of the best paced games ever made because each of its gameplay pillars is wonderfully designed and held up by the other pillars. Exploration and level design feed into the progression system, which feeds into the combat system, which feeds into the puzzle system, and back again. It's one of the most perfectly balanced, expertly crafted gameplay loops ever. Dead Space operates on a fairly simple repeating loop. The game opens with a cutscene, and Isaac is separated from the others in a sequence that perfectly sets the tone and terror that will accompany the player over the next 15 hours or so. Now, as a fun little aside, on my last playthrough I noticed this dude right here who gets torn apart has a red sash on his arm, which made me wonder if it was a nice little nod to him being a red shirt. Anyway, after the initial setup, each loop begins with a transmission telling Isaac about something he must accomplish. You'll have to look at your objective by exploring some very dark levels that are illuminated by the best lighting system of its time. These levels are relatively simple and small, but locked doors, and the tension inherent in the gameplay keeps players moving slowly and carefully. You will explore and loot rooms, listening to the ambient noises. After a time, there'll be a combat sequence, then explore, combat sequence, puzzle, combat sequence, and on to the next objective before finding the tram and moving to the next level. All of that is simple enough, and it is a pretty standard third-person action gameplay loop. Hell, as I wrote this out, I realized it's basically the exact same loop as Tomb Raider. Explore, loot, fight, puzzle. So what makes Dead Space so damn compelling? It's the fact that Dead Space does everything right. And I mean everything. Levels aren't particularly big, but they are very well designed. Strong art direction and logical layout make the levels feel like real places, and when levels feel like real places, where real things happened, it allows the player to get immersed. Immersion has become a kind of buzzword, so what are we actually talking about? When a game effectively immerses you, it subtly turns off the part of your brain that tells you you are playing a game. A near magical transportation occurs where the pixels on the screen become an actual avatar for the player. Once put into that state, the player can now be manipulated emotionally and intellectually. Levels that feel real create questions in the player's mind. What's this area for? What happened here? I wonder what's behind that door. And when you combine that mental state with top-notch environmental storytelling, you've got a game experience that rivals what great cinema provides. The ability to put ourselves in a character's shoes. Dead Space uses its perfectly created levels and its constantly disturbing ambient noise to keep the player focused on carefully moving. In the interview we played earlier, Watan talked about how the actual loaded chunks the player is in are quite small because of how intense Dead Space was in last generation GPUs. This means frequent loading was needed. Every time you come to one of the doors, you are loading another area. And this small detail is a wonderful example of how well designed Dead Space is, because those doors don't produce the effect that most loading sequences do in a player. I have enjoyed all of the 3D Bethesda Fallout games. I find the exploration and combat loop in their wonderfully realized worlds to be completely engrossing in a way that few open world games are. Slowly crawling through a dungeon, avoiding feral ghouls while low on health, and carefully looting boxes is so immersive. Until you come to a door that says something other than open. When you come to a door with a name on it in Fallout, All of the carefully building tension and immersion drains out as you realize the game is about to stop and load a new area. All the maps in Dead Space combined are probably comparable to a couple of large Bethesda dungeons, and yet they still require frequent loading of chunks. But presumably aware that loading screens would crush the oppressive atmosphere of the game, Visceral didn't just try to minimize loading screens, it uses them as another tool to immerse the player. Instead, the small pauses as you open a door, or the much longer loading times as you wait for an elevator to finish its trip, only serve to increase the tension the player feels. Dead Space takes things very, very slowly for an action title. Everything in the game serves the function of making the player feel uncomfortable, even its loading screens. Being low on health and ammo as you slowly ride the elevator down, listening to the noisy ambient silence of the soundscape are some of the best and most unsettling moments in the game. There are several instances where monsters attack you in the elevators early on, meaning that for the rest of the playtime, the player is never comfortable in a loading sequence again. Even the small detail of having elevator doors open on both sides of the car feels carefully designed to maximize suspense. Monsters can and do attack immediately when elevators open, so you'll find yourself positioning Isaac right in the center of the car and turning him back and forth so you can try and see which door is going to open as quickly as possible. It's all of these details that make Dead Space and its relatively small map feel much bigger and less linear than it actually is. The game keeps you tense and nervous, so you move slowly. And because combat can happen at any time, is dangerous, and uses a lot of resources, a small detour needs to be managed carefully. So even if the alternate path is only 5 or 6 rooms, players will traverse those 5 or 6 rooms very deliberately. And because monsters can spawn on your way back, you'll come back through those rooms just as carefully as you went out. It's this pace that allows Dead Space to get more space out of relatively small levels. And it's the pacing that perfectly allows the game to simultaneously be a really fun, powerful shooter and also a tense, slow-burning, creepy horror game. The actual level design and player traversal are wonderfully reinforced for maximum tension by the brilliant way the game handles its map and waypoints. Dead Space doesn't give you a floating diamond-shaped map marker. In a brilliant and wonderfully intuitive system, clicking the right stick puts a short-lived glowing line on the ground that points directly to your next objective. So you click the right stick and you watch as the line radiates out from you into the darkness before dishearteningly ending at a darkened door, or as it plummets down into an elevator shaft. This system, this basic system, is such an incredibly important part of the overall experience that whoever designed it is a genius. Simply replacing this with a floating diamond off in the distance like most games, or a fully functioning map with a big yellow circle telling you where to go, or even the ability to place map markers would have drastically changed the game for the worse. It can be incredibly spooky to watch the waypoint path trail off into a dark corridor where you've been hearing grunts and screams, or to see it turn abruptly around a smoky corner. The system is incredibly precise and effective, meaning that the player never gets stuck in eliminating frustrating wrong turns. But it's also vague and short-lived enough that you don't feel as if you know exactly where you're going. All it really does is tell you the next room you need to get to, and then the next, and then the next. One of the game's greatest triumphs is making the player feel lost on a huge ship when you're actually on a linear path through a continuing series of very small gameplay spaces. And here's where we get into the part where systems bleed into each other. Because the weapon and armor upgrades are the core of the progression system, you will also need to ignore the glowing path occasionally and wander off trying to find ammo, money, and power nodes before following the waypoints back to where you were. The waypoint system combines with 3 other seemingly small things that make simply moving about the levels so good. 1. Opening your inventory or map does not pause the game. When you're playing Dead Space, you are playing Dead Space. Very much like Dark Souls, you will never feel comfortable or safe as long as you are moving about the levels. There's no way to quickly pause and sort your inventory, or use the map, or find a store. Everything that has a gameplay function must be done in real time. It's only when you play a game like Dark Souls or Dead Space that you realize just how much an inventory or map that pauses the game breaks your immersion. Even long after you feel like you've figured out when you are and are not in danger, you'll still always be immersed, and the sound design and building tension mean this game is intense to play at almost all times. Second, the immersion is further held up by one of gaming's greatest ever HUDs. Because there isn't one. There's no health bar, there's no ammo counter, the screen isn't cluttered with a whole bunch of shit like objectives and whatever. Look at this. Now look at this. It's just Isaac, the levels, and the monsters. This means there's nothing to break the illusion. It doesn't feel like you're watching a game. It gives an incredibly cinematic feel, and the decision to display Isaac's health and stasis charge, not with a typical heads-up display, but instead to integrate it directly into the character model, was another stroke of pure genius. So immersive, it's weird that more games haven't done it. This clean, minimalist UI and the lack of a heads-up display mean your attention is never taken off of the game. Isaac's health is communicated to player in real time by the lights on his spine. The charge on your time-slowing stasis gun is on your shoulder. Isaac's ammo is displayed on the gun, and only when he aims it. When the gun is getting close to needing to be reloaded, the little screen goes red. There is never a reason to divert your attention from the character model itself or his surroundings at any time, and the lack of a pausing inventory system means when you need to use the inventory, you have to use the inventory. When you need to use the map, you need to use the map. And when you're playing the game, you're playing the game and focusing only on what the designers have created. I've talked before about how much mini-maps and quest markers have changed games. They've added convenience, a lot of convenience, but also greatly diminished player immersion and led to increasingly lazy level and quest design in games. Dead Space solves basically all of these problems. It's the best UI ever in a game as far as I'm concerned, and something I wish more games would emulate. The final, excellent choice that maintains immersion is that saving can only be done at certain stations within the levels. They're spaced far enough to be nerve-wracking on the harder difficulties, but close enough that you will never lose frustration-inducing levels of progress. This, obviously, is a system common to the survival horror genre. Resident Evil famously used its typewriter ribbons as save spots, but this is not a common feature of action-oriented combat-focused games. The decision to keep this system is a tremendous benefit to the overall experience. The ammo economy, currency, upgrade nodes, and save spots are so well spaced that this might be the most perfectly balanced game I've ever played. You will never have enough of anything, but you will also never be totally fucked with absolutely nothing. Even on the hardest difficulty, it's unlikely you will ever get stuck in a death loop. And the game smartly allows for multiple save files to minimize the chance that players will be trapped with no way to escape. The game gives you exactly what you need and nothing more, turning even its basic save system, currencies, and ammo economy into a kind of game-length management puzzle. I can't stress enough how well designed these levels and progression feel. It utterly lacks any feeling of grindiness, and it never requires excessive backtracking. You never feel totally lost, but you also never feel perfectly comfortable with where you are. Balanced is probably the perfect word to describe almost every system in the game, including combat, where the game truly shines. Surviving on the Ishimura. It would have been easy to have the enemies in this game be simple zombies. When you boil it down, that's what they are, right? You'll be fighting the reanimated dead, and if you're going to be fighting the reanimated dead, why spend a shitload of time fixing what ain't broke? Everyone loves a good old shuffling zombie. To spice it up, you throw in the occasional fast zombie, and then the fat boss zombie. Boom. Horror game enemy design. And with how well everything else in the game is done, if Visceral had taken the easy way out and just did your normal zombie enemy design, it still might have been an all-time classic. But that is not the case. Enemy design and variety is uniformly excellent, with arresting, unique, and memorable creature design that allow for a really great set of gameplay mechanics that tweak the usual zombie shooter combat. According to Wikipedia, the game's artists studied accident and murder scene photography when designing the enemies, and it absolutely shows. Enemies are gruesome because they are recognizably human while also being transformed enough to be truly horrific. I've always thought that the reason people are afraid of zombies isn't because they maim and kill. Pit bulls maim and kill, but I spend almost every night with two huge ones fighting over which gets to sleep on my chest. Zombies are scary because they embody our deepest anxieties. The loss of individuality. The possibility that you are just exactly like everything and everyone else. That there's nothing special about you. That you're only a bipedal lump of meat. The zombie terrifies because being bitten means you keep living while being stripped of everything it means to be alive, of the only things that make you human. Dead Space's zombies work so well because they combine the body horror and gory death we all fear with our dread of the alien and unknown, while also being husks of former people, stripped of their humanity and individuality. Each enemy in Dead Space was a person, and these all combine to make them perfect avatars of our single greatest fear, the loss of our free will. From an art design and storytelling angle, the Dead Space enemies are fantastical, but familiar enough to be scary. From a gameplay perspective, enemy design is just amazingly fucking great. All enemies require different strategies to fight, and this means that each weapon has a purpose and proper use. Enemy and weapon variety are insanely important in games, man. It's what keeps the same combat interesting from hour 1 to hour 20. But just having 10 different guns that all serve the same function isn't enough. I'm still playing AC Odyssey, which offers many different weapons to use, but they all serve the same function. None are really more effective against any particular enemy than another. It's just style and spectacle. Dead Space's weapons serve more as puzzle-solving tools. Each weapon has a very specific function it excels at, and certain enemies it is most effective at handling. And because each enemy is perfectly designed to require a specific response from the player, managing what weapon to use, saving the right ammo for the right enemy, and making every shot count means that the weapon system and enemy design go hand in hand in a way all games should, but very few actually do. As one easy example, the starting plasma cutter has plentiful ammo, pinpoint accuracy, as well as the ability to turn the beam either horizontally or vertically, which makes it perfect for taking out weaker enemies that don't move all that fast. But its lack of power and narrow beam mean that it is not a great weapon to take out tough enemies, or the ones who move incredibly fast or are very small. Other weapons do those things better, and this is all reinforced because Dead Space isn't asking you to shoot every enemy in the head. Dead Space's addicting gunplay revolves around dismembering enemies as they lumber toward you. You have to shoot off their arms and legs in order to kill them. The early levels feature the standard enemies who move fairly slowly until they get near you, at which point they begin running. But as the game progresses, enemies begin moving much, much faster. New enemies are consistently introduced, ones that jump through the air, some that hang from ceilings, others that are huge and slow but incredibly deadly up close, small enemies that are dangerous in swarms. It can get very hectic and intense. And on top of its satisfying gunplay and the impressive weapon and enemy design, Dead Space has the Stasis module, which serves as a crowning cherry on top of a combat system that would have been nearly perfect even without it. The Stasis module allows players to shoot objects to make them move in slow motion for a short time. It's first introduced to the player as a tool for the game's puzzles, and it will be really well used in most puzzles going forward. But immediately after doing the first 2 simple puzzles, players will come into a hallway and be confronted by one of the standard walking enemies and a new, very fast enemy that can hurl itself through the air at you. It's here that most players will probably use the module in combat for the first time, even though the game never actually tells you to do this. The Stasis module is clearly introduced as a puzzle-solving mechanic, but it's also absolutely essential as a combat tool in any setting above easy. When confronted with multiple enemies, as a player will almost always be, part of the combat is deciding which of the fastest moving enemies is most dangerous, and therefore a priority target. You can then use the module to slow that enemy down, and you can either kill them, or immobilize them in that state and use the time it provides to attack another enemy while getting into a better position. It is, even today, a totally unique combat system that feels fresh and fun 10 years later on a 5th playthrough. This tool is obviously far too powerful to be used all the time, so the player has only a couple of uses at their disposal before needing to recharge it at a station or with a consumable ammo pack. And though you can heal with a button press while in combat, you cannot recharge your stasis pack without going into your inventory menu, making recharging it while in combat a hectic, tactical choice. Visceral could very easily have given the player a button for recharging the stasis without going into the menu, but they didn't. And that deliberate choice shows just how well balanced and thoughtfully designed the game's combat systems are. In addition to the solid gunplay, Dead Space uses its excellent sound design and music to make every combat encounter feel like a scene from Alien. From the sound of your weapon, to the howls of the necromorphs, to the game's ambient sound and music, combat sequences in Dead Space always manage to have the player on edge. Let's take a look at a typical one right now. depth. We've already established that Dead Space doesn't do only one thing well. With the level design, enemy variety, music, and story, Dead Space could have had a very simple, average third-person shooting system and it would have been a fantastic game. But the reason it's an all-time classic is because Dead Space doesn't settle for good enough anywhere. Dead Space has a shockingly deep combat system. With 4 weapons, the time-slowing module, and the telekinesis module available to the player, there are always multiple ways to approach an encounter. And because the game never strays too far from its survival horror inspiration, ammo is rare enough and enemies hit hard enough that players will need to be as efficient as possible dispatching necromorphs, while also not letting themselves get overrun and brutally dismembered themselves. Oh yeah, we should check that out. Watch this. The game, like every good combat game ever, slowly ramps its difficulty. You will be consistently introduced to new enemies, and each new one will require a new tactic to beat. There are the big fat guys that require you to kill them without bursting them open or they'll spill horrible little face huggers everywhere. There are the super fast necromorphs, the dead babies who fling projectiles, the horrendous bat things that bring dead enemies back to life, the explodey guys, the crazy fast ones that hide and ambush you. There are 14 distinct enemies as well as several bosses in the game, and all of them not only have unique and interesting art design, all of them have unique and interesting combat mechanics. This isn't 14 different character models or skins on 2 enemies that behave essentially the same. These are all wholly unique combat obstacles that appear in any number of different rooms with different combinations and numbers. It makes combat feel fresh and challenging all the way through the game. Each enemy has a weapon that works best on it, but all of them can be taken out with any weapon, though not as efficiently. This ramping difficulty means you can't simply ignore weapon upgrades either, so you will need to explore the ship so that you have enough materials to increase the damage, magazine, and fire rate of your weapons, and there are just enough materials without being so many that you can make your decisions willy-nilly. Which, by the way, is another amazing example of each system reinforcing the others. Combat gets harder, and certain enemies require certain weapons, so you need to upgrade several. In order to upgrade several, you will need money and power nodes. To get money and power nodes, you need to explore the entire level. Exploring the entire level leads to more combat with dangerous enemies, etc. All of these weapons feel good to shoot. There isn't a bunch of aim assists, but that's okay because the game isn't asking you to shoot things in their tiny little heads. The combat is more about positioning, staying calm, and executing your plan. Good gunplay, great weapons, great combat arenas, and aggressive, interesting enemies means the combat never gets boring in Dead Space. Played in the harder difficulties where enemies have lots of health, do lots of damage, and ammo is scarce means the game is a challenge without feeling cruel. It's perfect. All of this is well reinforced by the small details in the game design. The game uses a very, very tight third-person camera, and though you can sprint to escape tough spots, the game always locks you into its combat arenas so you can't just run away from enemies. Combat rooms will have you sprinting around to make space, taking out enemies in the order of their threat level. It is always hectic. It is always perfectly balanced to usually feel like you just made it out. While you're tearing up that first little group of monsters, you're going to feel powerful. Then the fight will throw more and more enemies until you aren't sure you'll have enough ammo and health to survive before the onslaught finally ends with you victorious, but hurting and, as usual, so low on ammo that you end up feeling vulnerable and tense. Enemies are almost never statically waiting in a room for you to arrive and blow them away. In fact, I'm not sure that ever happens anywhere in the game. Instead, the enemies are constantly breaking through the walls behind you, and because Isaac does not have a quick turn, you spend the entire game feeling surrounded, and like Isaac moves just barely fast enough. And all of this is accomplished without the frustrating artificial gimping of player movement through ridiculous tank controls. There's no stamina system, you can sprint, and you don't turn like a truck. The game doesn't need to handicap your movement to make you nervous, so while you feel vulnerable, the game still feels good to play. It plays and moves like an action game and not a survival horror game. When you fail, you don't feel like it's because the game decided to make you turn and move like a cruise ship. Killed some necromorphs? That's a puzzling. Even with how great the levels are to explore, a solid and fun progression system, and a fantastic combat system, Dead Space's gameplay wouldn't be complete without its pretty excellent puzzle sections. It is hard to say what makes a good puzzle section in a game, or what makes a good puzzle game, period. I love Infinifactory, and Portal 2 are two of the best games ever made, but I didn't like The Witness at all. Totally subjective, I guess. Puzzles in puzzle games have to walk a fine line between hard enough to be challenging, but easy enough to not make the player get pissed off and quit. Action game puzzles walk an even finer line. They exist mainly to pace the gameplay and give players a palate cleanse. If Dead Space was built around the puzzles it has on offer, it wouldn't succeed. But of course, the game isn't built around puzzle sections. That being said, there are a surprising variety of puzzle sequences for a game mainly about shooting monsters that rip people apart and reanimate their corpses. Now, I like the puzzles in Resident Evil games. I actually quite liked the puzzles in Resident Evil 7, a game that succeeded at most of what it tried to do, but do those puzzles make any sense? Like, why did someone set up elaborate puzzles involving rotating objects to cast shadows at paintings in order to unlock rooms where they hide their pistol? And how do these magical shadow puzzles actually work? And can I install one in the drawer I store my drugs in? Lots of action or horror games with puzzles have this issue. The puzzles are fine on their own, but they start to not really make sense narratively if you make the mistake of thinking about them. What shadow puzzle room contractor did you use? Oh yeah, I used 24-hour shadow locks, they gave the lowest bid. Dead Space manages to avoid these narrative puzzle justification backflips because Isaac is an engineer. He is specifically on the ship to repair it, and all of the puzzles are actually mini-games where he's tasked with repairing a part of the ship. The puzzles revolve around either using the stasis module, the telekinesis module, timing-based platforming in 0G, timed exploration sequences in a no-atmosphere environment, or often a combination of all of these elements. The game's puzzles are all familiar enough that none of them frustrate you by being too vague, yet they're just challenging enough to be compelling gameplay sequences in their own right. And as the game moves forward, Visceral begins to throw combat sequences into the puzzle section so that you're never doing just one thing. Going back to play the game, I was actually quite surprised at how many of these I remembered 9 years later, which I think speaks volumes about the quality of the design. And again, I don't remember the RE7 puzzles aside from the fact that they involved rotating objects to cast shadows. And I played that game only a year ago, and I liked those puzzles. Nothing in Dead Space is done badly. Nothing feels like it's there to pad out time. It is a perfect gameplay formula. Story, explore, loot, shoot, puzzle. This formula will take you through the entire game without it ever getting boring because each of those pillars are well designed and fun to play on their own while also being perfectly paced. It's rare that I look up how many chapters are in a game as I play it, but as I replayed Dead Space, I found myself doing just that. Because what's here is so substantial and provides so much value and is so good that I never want to be getting near the end, even on what is my 5th playthrough of a 10-year-old game. The look and sound of space. I think it's kind of safe to say that the Xbox 360, PS3 console generation was when games really hit their stride visually. At the start of the generation, games like The Elder Scrolls Oblivion were achieving polygon counts high enough to produce reasonably lifelike character models and large, beautiful environments. By 2008, with the release of Dead Space, we were fully in the modern era of gaming graphics. Still, texture resolution remained fairly low by the standards we're used to today, and assets were more frequently and obviously reused in levels than what we see in big-budget AAA games now. This meant that while resolution was good enough to engross the player, it was still low enough that very strong art direction was an absolute must if the player is to be fully immersed in a realized game world. Which is to say that Dead Space launched at the perfect time. Far enough into the current generation so that textures and resolution aren't distracting, even when playing today. So it remains a classic that should hold up well enough to be played forever. The art direction is so good that one could argue that Ishimura itself is a character in the game. The beat-up, lived-in industrial space aesthetic of the first Alien movie is used to perfection here. Even the ship's name kind of reminds me of the Nostromo. And the signs and details in the rooms and sections of the ship make it feel like a real place where people lived and worked and loved and died. It's these details that make me pine so hard for a straight remake of the game for modern hardware. The small details on display in the existing game are fantastic. Imagine what could be achieved today. Still, even as is, because the game's lighting is so low for much of it, you will never be focusing too long on the slightly dated textures or models. And the game is fully modern in how the levels work. The ability to have interactive objects in game levels was a giant leap forward from the static backdrops that marked games of the previous generations. Things move and fall as you walk around rooms. Corpses can be picked up. Stretchers can be pushed around, there's abandoned luggage and litter all over. Dead Space released at a time when game levels, even on console, were finally able to simulate enough physics objects to start feeling like real places. Each area feels like it was lovingly crafted to elicit the maximum amount of tension. We can't talk about how good this game looks and why it is so gorgeous 10 years later without talking about perhaps its most impressive technological feature. Dead Space used an absolutely groundbreaking dynamic lighting system to produce levels full of moving, creeping shadows. Back in 2008, just before the release of Dead Space, David Blizzard gave a presentation at EA's community event where he discussed the game's lighting. Blizzard, who had worked as a lighting director in film before becoming Dead Space's lighting director, went into great detail explaining all the amazing ways that Dead Space moved video game lighting forward. I've seen some conflicting reports in my research, but one thing is clear. Dead Space was either the first, or at very least one of the first 2 games ever to use a dynamic lighting system, and this is perhaps why Dead Space was so impressive looking for the time. In previous games, lighting had to be static because it was highly intensive on GPUs. Let's demonstrate this by looking at a gorgeous game that came out only months before Dead Space, and then its sequel that switched to a dynamic lighting system when it released years later. Static lighting in practice meant that lighting was either ambient and didn't come from an actual source, or was baked into an object to save rendering time and power. Watch as we walk around these levels of Portal and are unable to locate the source of the diffuse light. The level is simply lit from no actual source at all, which means that shadows are simply permanent static effects applied to sections of the level or are cast from objects themselves, rather than from interplaying with a light source. Look at how the room has no light source, but how our trusty companion cube here seems to cast its own shadow, even though there isn't actually a light interacting with it dynamically. Or here, we can look at the baked-in lighting. The lamp has a light pasted onto it, but it's not actually casting light. Neither of these lighting systems could affect objects in motion, and shadows, again, were permanent features laid onto the level to simulate light coming from an object. Now, Portal had amazing art direction, and remains a really great-looking game. So while developers' sleight of hand and skill can use static lighting to make a beautiful or creepy or exciting scene, there was no way to actually make a level fully interact with light, the way a film or real life would. Now let's take a look at a couple of things in Portal 2, which released 4 years after Portal and 3 years after Dead Space first used dynamic lighting. Portal 2 didn't use a fully dynamic lighting system. It used the same static lighting as the original Portal, but also used dynamic lighting in certain sections to great effect. Let's take a look at some. Watch how the shadows here are actually interacting with a real light source. Moving about the level changes the shadow patterns because the light is real. So while the assets and textures remain very similar to Portal, Portal 2's dynamic lighting system drastically improves the look and especially the feel of these levels. I mean, look at the difference here side by side. Dead Space used its dynamic lighting system so that shadows move as the player moves about the level. The game uses lights that swing about to produce an effect exactly like one would see in a horror movie. The Ishimura feels real in a way that would have been very difficult to achieve with static lighting. For most of the game, the levels are incredibly dark, which heightens attention and also happily serves to de-emphasize the low resolution of the textures and means your attention isn't taking note of reuse of assets on the walls or the floors. The game also made a smart choice by having the player's flashlight attached to your gun, which, in practice, means your attention is often laser focused in a small cone directly in front of you. To illuminate levels, you need to aim and turn, which eventually makes it feel like you are constantly in danger as you slowly swivel about a room to see if anything's amiss. And of course, you can't aim and run, so when you decide to sprint, you will be doing so in the dark. Dead Space 2 ended up being even darker, but Dead Space 1 often puts the player in near pitch black for moments at a time. Every so often, all of the lights will go out in a room before red emergency lights come on and you'll have to fight off a monster attack. The game frequently produces a kind of god ray as light sources are occluded by objects that are swinging within the environment, and the game's heavy use of fog and smoke-like particle effects is incredibly impressive for the time. Smoke drifts in front of lamps that barely illuminate corridors. The lighting of the game is as important as any other art asset it has to offer. It's one of the main reasons the game feels real, and to this day, it is impossible to play it without occasionally stopping to marvel at a particularly gorgeous scene produced by its amazing use of incredibly bright white lights mixed with pitch black shadow. It's this that makes every level feel rich and real and frightening. I have a pretty good PC, but I expected Dead Space will run on highest settings on almost any PC these days. But even playing the backwards compatible version on the Xbox One looks just fantastic. It only runs at 30 FPS, but its uniformly amazing direction and gorgeous lighting make it an impactful and great looking game even today, even on console. The sound of space. Art design, creatures, and lighting set the horror tone, but what drives it all home is the game's all-time amazing music and sound design. Now, these are typical horror trope sound designs. Pipes drop, clanging in the distance. Ambient soundscapes that are familiar and disturbing, screams and growls, but they're done so well that even though you've heard stuff like this in 1,000 horror movies, it still does its job perfectly. Let's just take a moment to watch a clip. Pay attention to all the different sounds that fill the background and produce what I can only describe as a kind of loud silence. I'm fascinated by soundscapes and the way that disparate noises that are innocuous on their own can combine to produce feelings of dread or joy. Played with headphones, this game can be downright disturbing. Check it out. Monster sounds are guttural and grotesque, and the variety of wet, fleshy sounds that come as necromorphs get torn apart or when the flying bat thing brings corpses back to life is awful. The game won Best Sound Design from every publication and awards convention that gave out such an honor in 2008, and composer Jason Graves' score is absolutely perfect. It's the kind of score that people who aren't musicians might not even notice. Much of it is ambient and subtle. It's often lingering just below the level of consciousness and will rise so slowly before bursting into a cacophony of intense, dissonant noise during dramatic moments or combat, and then abruptly ending before a player even realizes they've been listening to music. This isn't music you're actually supposed to notice. It's music as emotional manipulation. It's effective precisely because it manipulated you without you realizing you'd even heard anything at all. The sound design, done by David Feiss, Andrew Lackey, and David Swenson, is just as uniformly excellent and accounts for much of the game's tension and power. The ambient noises and dissonant string arrangements that normally signify imminent jump scares are used often enough as false alarms that the actual jump scares are almost never telegraphed. And even when you do know that a monster attack is coming, the game does an excellent job of waiting and waiting and waiting, with a rising string crescendo and the ambient background noise building and falling until the attack finally comes and still startles even though you were fully aware it was about to happen. That is what great sound design can do in a movie or a game. Fully set the stage and prepare you for what's about to come while still surprising you. It is a very fine line. Little things like this are the tricks of the trade in creative endeavors. Musicians know how to use rhythm and melody to elicit certain responses as if they were a language, and in the hands of masters, combined with everything else Dead Space does, they serve to have the player's emotions totally at the mercy of the game's designers. Like all horror, it only works if you let it, but if you're willing to meet the game halfway and let it do its work, it is as effective as any other horror game ever made, which is pretty great considering it's an action game too. The story of Dead Space. How important is story in a game? That's a question that depends entirely on the player and on the game. What's Become of Edith Finch was an absolutely breathtaking display of storytelling in games, so good it barely needed any gameplay at all. The Last of Us took the gameplay of Uncharted, which I loathe as much as any other popular game ever, and added a relatively shallow crafting system and a story that blew me away to make a deeply affecting game that ranks as one of the best in recent memory. The first Resident Evil game has a story so hilariously bad, with acting so insanely awful, that you could argue the game would have been better with no story at all.
Whoa! This hall is dangerous. There must be a back door somewhere. Let's try to find it first, shall we? Just a moment. I found something.
What is it?
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things.
Gameplay carried Resident Evil. Gameplay and art and level design. Destiny had one of the worst AAA campaign stories in recent memory, but gameplay so goddamn good I didn't care less. The greatest games of the earliest eras of gaming didn't even bother with a story. What's the story of Pac-Man? The giant leap forward that is, sorry, but the princess is in another castle, or the early Doom title shows that story isn't even needed at all for great games. For me, stories in video games are like dessert. Nice to have, and occasionally you'll stumble across a delicacy so good you'll remember it forever, but you don't really need it, and usually it's just a heavy extravagance that leaves you feeling a bit queasy. When you find a great gameplay experience, sometimes the best you can hope for is a story that doesn't actively make it shittier. That is my general expectation for stories and games. Just don't shit all over it and make me spend my time shaking my head wondering how someone got paid to write this garbage. Dead Space could have had no story beyond dude trapped on ship, dude need to escape, and it would still be a total classic. The story wasn't even needed to achieve everything the game sets out to accomplish, so you would assume you'd save the resources and do your best to deliver a story that simply doesn't fuck it up. But that's not what happened. Dead Space has a pretty standard sci-fi horror setup. It's Alien. A crew is trapped on an infested ship, they need to figure out a way to escape. But Visceral wrote a compelling story with good voice acting, facial models, NPC animations, and dialogue, and on top of all that, it effectively used a silent protagonist, which usually doesn't work very well in a video game narrative. As you wander the ship, you will find very well-written text logs and high-quality audio logs that tell you the fate of the crew members and fill you in on how exactly the alien infestation started and spread. The interesting wrinkle is the religious zealotry angle that Visceral used. By having the infestation being helped along by a powerful religious group that thinks the aliens are the key to immortality, it allows for a fun examination of religious belief and the nature of faith in the face of reality. And the truth is, the church is correct. The aliens are a kind of immortality. I mean, immortality is horrible rotting corpse monsters, but beggars can't be choosers, right? Text and audio logs, when done well, can add so much to a game, and the early 360 era was like the golden age of the audio log. Dead Space doesn't have much in the way of cutscenes outside of the opening, but it does have several sections where the friendly NPCs interact and provide exposition or character development. Both of the friendly NPCs, along with Isaac, are really well acted, and the paranoia of neither trusting the other means there's a good amount of mystery involved all throughout. Now, this isn't some amazing, perfect video game story. It's got a few flaws. First, Isaac's girlfriend Nicole feels forced in and pointless. She doesn't serve a narrative purpose beyond, well, the player character's a dude, so he probably needs a pretty girl to save, right? Let's make her a blonde. It's very hard to give a shit about her. I know nothing about her. I don't know how long they were together, whether they broke up, why they broke up, nothing really. So it's kind of hard to have the story center around a character's love interest when the character literally doesn't have a face or voice. Now, it doesn't necessarily really hurt the narrative, but it's the kind of weak attempt at characterization that many lesser games engage in. It's a minor blemish on an otherwise very restrained, focused, and confident story, and an extremely compelling lore and universe. The second and third game chose to have Isaac be voiced and faced, and it works well. As a result, we get to understand more about him and his relationship to the blonde love interest, but this game, the choice of a blank slate avatar that's supposed to be a stand-in for the player, doesn't work at all with the desire to also have the main character be a person with a history and a love interest. Likewise, there's a twist that comes out of nowhere and doesn't add much of anything to the story at all. Thankfully, the characters introduced in text and audio logs, as well as the other two NPCs, Dr. Klein and Chalice Mercer, the game's monologuing villain, are well acted and interesting and push the narrative forward while expanding on the religious zealotry sub-story in a compelling way. Dead Space has a surprisingly well fleshed out and realized universe. As we traverse the ship, we learn a lot about the world we're inhabiting. We're on a planet cracker that travels to deep space to literally break planets apart for raw materials. We learn about the religion of unitology, or unis as the non-unitologists derisively call them. In this game, the comics, the fun but not very good animated movie, and especially the next games, we learn about the government of Earth and the previous repression of unitology. For a new IP, gory survival horror action shooter, the game is incredibly lore heavy, and all of that lore works very well. So, it's not some ham-fisted story that has no reason to exist. It's restrained and a well-told tale, fleshed out with environmental storytelling and text and audio logs that fill us in on the universe so it feels like a real and logical place. It far surpasses my just don't shit on the game requirements and moves into the realm of an actually enjoyable sci-fi tale. The game didn't need it, but the quality of everything surrounding the story, from the writing, to the direction, to the acting and supplemental text and audio logs, is high enough to mean that the game succeeds with a story that doesn't try to be more than it needs to be. it never loses sight of the fact that first and foremost, this is an action horror gameplay experience, but it also has enough confidence to exceed the player's expectations. Or at least mine. But I mean, if a game has me Google its universe and watch an animated movie that's over an hour, it has succeeded with flying colors. I could go into actual granular detail about the story here, but it would take too long in a video that's already way too long. It's been long enough for most of you. I'm willing to bet you've forgotten everything but the bare bones of the narrative. Go back and play it again. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at just how successful the story actually is. Wrapping up. I ended up deciding to do the series on Dead Space games because at the beginning of the year, I got EA Origin access for my daughter so she could obsessively play The Sims 4. And when I saw that all 3 Dead Space games were on there, I figured I'd play them again. And I was so damn impressed with how insanely well they hold up, I did some research into the development of the games. It's rare that a game's lighting impresses me so much I do research into how games are lit. I started thinking about how much I'd love to see Visceral go back to the franchise and do a new trilogy with current graphics and lighting. During that research, I saw that the first Dead Space game was about to experience its 10-year anniversary, so I resolved to do the videos. And after all of that, right at about the same time, EA closed down Visceral and stopped development of the Amy Hennig-led Star Wars single-player game. What a waste. I can only hope that the people who were most responsible for Dead Space someday decide to return to the genre, or that EA hands this series over to a group of developers that could do the license justice. The universe is still ripe for stories and gameplay, and current hardware could produce a Dead Space game even better than what we had 10 years ago. In fact, a straight remake of the first game would be amazing, and almost certainly would sell better now than it did then. Over the next couple of months, I'll be doing a video on the next 2 games, one of which is very, very good, and the other which is interesting for a variety of reasons. But for now, I hope you will go back and give the first game another playthrough. It still stands up as an all-time classic, and it holds up as well as any other game of its era, and better than almost all of them. Coming up, I'll be doing some stuff on Fallout 76, AC Odyssey if I think it's worth talking about, Red Dead Redemption 2 probably, and I'll almost certainly have something annoying happen to me in Destiny 2 that I want to rant about. Alright, see you next time. Bye.